in production, there are primarily no data relevant to the production itself. Whether they are really somewhere in the background, whether I can do something with them is another matter. Of course, production has important data that I can work with. They are also fed into the ERP if I secure everything. That's not an issue either. But in production, availability is primarily what counts. And as you already mentioned, we have legacy systems that have been in use for 30 years. That I can't install the latest update on a system that has been in use for 30 years, but somehow have to work with the fact that it's an outdated system with vulnerabilities. I have to live with that.
Welcome to Cybersecurity Shall Be C-Level Priority, the podcast that puts the digital world to the test. Cyber attacks are on the rise, and data is the most valuable asset in today's world. But how can we protect what matters most to us? Drawing on the latest insights, effective strategies, and practical tools, we'll show you how to create a more secure digital environment. Because one thing is clear: security isn't negotiable, it's a top priority.
Hello, and welcome to a new episode of Cybersecurity Executive Matters, the podcast. Today with Sebastian. Hi, Sebastian.
Hi, Nico. Thanks for the invitation. I'm glad we can talk about the topic of OT security today. And it's a matter close to my heart to talk about this topic.
We've known each other for several years, starting back then at Coramis, or rather T-Land, where we also talked a lot about the topic of OT. And where we have occasionally conducted pen tests, and where we have also seen that not everyone can do OT pen tests, but maybe we'll get into that later. For those who don't know you yet, tell us a few sentences about yourself.
I've been involved in this whole topic for 12 years now, so everything related to IT and OT pen testing. I have a master's and bachelor's in computer and communication technology, which is a mix of mechatronics and computer science, with a focus on securing control systems, or rather how one can get into them. And since the beginning of the year, I have been the managing director and also the lead hacker at Pentaris Security, which I founded together with some colleagues to address the topic OTD pen testing, but also IT pen testing, awareness training, and incident response, to establish it in the market and show how companies can be made more secure and how the digital world can be better protected.
In the OT pen testing area, I've always seen a lot, and you can also share your opinion on that there are many companies doing IT pen testing and have simply noticed, hey, OT is a new market, a new green field. I mean, for us, it's not a green field anymore. We've known OT for a bit longer, but you can see that the market, especially in the OT area, is extremely mature, which makes me happy, because before you could do little with OT in Germany, you had to go abroad. Now, in Germany, the topic of OT has also become very, very mainstream, and many also want to do something. But there are also specific challenges in the relationship between IT and OT. Do you also see difficulties for someone who really comes from IT to actually conduct an OT pen test?
Definitely. If I haven't dealt with the topic of OT beforehand, then it's a huge problem, because of course, in an OT environment, which generally includes everything in a manufacturing industry, but also any special machines, I can't just run an Nmap scan, a Nessus scan, or anything similar over it, as I would naturally do in an IT environment. Of course, if it runs through, I also get my results. There are corresponding functions in the scanner that allow you to say, I am scanning an OT network. However, it does not proceed nearly as sensitively as one should in such networks, because you have to imagine these are real-time systems. This means they rely on having the appropriate communication that consistently works. And I also have to ensure fail safety, because especially in production, I want to produce 24/7. I must not generate any downtime, because a failure can quickly cost me several million. And if it's just 1 hour where production stops, I cannot afford that. This means the systems must continue to run consistently. And that is what I, as Pentaris, also have to ensure. That's why not everyone who can perform an IT pen test can also do an OT pen test. Conversely, it can be adapted more easily, because if I proceed more cautiously, I can, of course, scan an IT environment if I can scan an OT environment. It might take longer if I do it accordingly as in the OT area. Unfortunately, it doesn't work the other way around. That's why I have to specifically engage with the topic and also know what I'm attacking. And even there, I can gladly speak from experience, because We already had the point with a customer who said, yes, our networks are separated and nothing can happen there. And it would ultimately be our task to simply go onto the systems in a black box procedure, which we categorically refused in advance because we said, if the networks are not separated, it leads to significant problems in the OT network. The customer said he doesn't care, we should just proceed as one would and act accordingly aggressively. There were complete approvals for this, which led to a delay in a carpentry shop. And in a carpentry shop, a delay of a few milliseconds means a few millimeters of offset, which means the production of the product could be thrown away. And I always have to say, many IT people or even production don't really know what it means when I conduct the test and how far the system's really separated, because a real separation doesn't really exist anymore these days.
You just mentioned an important point, and I also saw that in joint projects back then. There was such a project, we can't talk about clients, but from a large, let's say, company that transports people, where we were supposed to conduct a pen test. And in the end, we ended up through the client's network into a network of a provider, or rather a company that was responsible for the maintenance of the facility. And those were the things for me that also need to be considered, especially in the OT area. OT networks are networks that contain a lot of technology, and maybe we'll talk a bit more about that in detail in a moment for the people who still have the question mark about what OT actually means. And these are also networks that are often managed and maintained by third parties, because there are productions that are so specialized that they are handled by suppliers. And that is also the challenge for me, especially when we look at OT pool, how to handle it when there is external communication entering these networks, whether it's via VPN or, let's say, a fixed connection, where you can often see that this can also lead to problems. Because just as you mentioned, this carelessness in quotes to say, well, a sharp Nmap, nothing can happen with that. But in the OT area, we are also talking about old systems, legacy systems, which do not like being bombarded with many requests at all. On the contrary, they end up shutting down and saying, no, you shouldn't come to me with that request. And I also believe that this is the case. The danger in the OT pen testing area, when trying to simply adapt the methods from IT into OT, one must understand that OT environments are not designed for such tests, but as you already mentioned, they are designed for productivity. They need to run 24/7, 365 days a year, and are not designed to just receive data packets and process them. This often leads to these systems losing their programming, their process, and then doing other things.
Exactly. So generally, you have to be a bit careful, as this differs quite a lot, significantly. In production, I simply have the issue of availability, whereas in IT, the biggest concern is confidentiality. And of course, I have to look at where my data is, what data I have, what remains there. None of this matters in production. In production, there are primarily no data relevant to the production itself. Whether they are really somewhere in the background, whether I can do something with them is another matter. Of course, production has important data that I can work with. They are also fed into the ERP if I secure everything. That's not an issue either. But in production, availability is primarily what counts. And as you already mentioned, we have legacy systems that have been in use for 30 years, that I can't install the latest update on a system that has been in use for 30 years, but somehow have to work with the fact that it's an outdated system with vulnerabilities. I have to live with that, but I have to secure the entire system accordingly so that I restrict communication and limit access to the system in order to work securely within the network as well. And the second major issue I have is, of course, I have a network where I know there are vulnerabilities. I know I have to proceed sensitively, but I still want to have maintenance. I want to have support. And I often find myself in conflict with the manufacturer, because the manufacturer says there is this one support option. You get access here. It has to be via VPN. It has to be via TeamViewer. And the customer is actually dependent on accepting it this way. Because if you don't accept it and say, well, I can't use TeamViewer, it goes against my policy, then the manufacturer rightly says, well, then unfortunately, I can't provide you with support. On the system like that, then I'm torn. Do I now take the path and say, okay, I'll take the risk, I'll use TeamViewer, even though I know very well that it's insecure? Or do I say, I'll forego the support, which I know is also pretty stupid, because if I don't have support for the system, well, who will set up the system for me? Then, because it's extremely costly to assign someone to deal with the system just to set it up, that is usually far too expensive. That means I have to find a middle ground, but there are also good options available for what can be used. but I really have to engage with the topic. That means, for example, how can I grant access? How can I ensure that there is a four eyes principle or something similar? And then the system is, of course, somewhat secure again, even though it is naturally an insecure path.
And you mentioned an important topic, which we always tell our customers, or also to people who are currently dealing with the topic, an OT operation. The highest priority is always availability. That means, especially regarding suppliers or people who access the systems, this path is often taken even by the staff. They need to access the system as easily as possible, because if there is any disruption or system failure, the provider X must be able to quickly access the systems to see what has happened and which programming needs to be adjusted, and so on. Security is often placed at the back because it is clearly stated that it must work, and it doesn't necessarily have to work safely in quotes. And since we're already talking about OT, maybe let's take a step back. What are some typical OT components that we know? So clearly we've already talked about production, but what are some components that you encounter daily in the OT area, so to speak?
I think at this point, I need to elaborate a bit on what OT actually is, because many people simply equate OT with operational technology and say it is synonymous with production. Yes, Biraj, production is an essential part of the OT system, meaning everything that is in the manufacturing sector, such as conveyor belts, transport belts, robots, but also all the equipment that is in there. However, OT also means special facilities, special devices that are accordingly detached from IT, which do not fall into the IT category. This includes a multitude of medical devices, such as pacemakers, X-ray machines, but also all those measurement systems that measure radiation accordingly. You mentioned earlier the topic of having these transport systems. Airplanes also fall under this category, as do large electric vehicles. All of these are systems that do not fall into the IT category and therefore automatically into OT, because OT is all about specialization. Many are familiar with the term IoT, which also in a certain way counts as OT. But these are then small devices that naturally ensure communication in some way. And this is what you see everywhere and all the time. So where does OT start? What do you see there? We see quite a lot because we are, of course, specialized in this area. Typically, the most well-known thing that many deal with is simply a so-called PLC, or programmable logic controller, which also controls these robots and so on. I can imagine it like this. On one side, I have an Ethernet connection where the network is connected, and on the other side, I communicate directly with ones and zeros where the parameters are adjusted up and down, and this is done using proprietary protocols that try to operate the system. That means behind this PLC, I have a current sensor that either performs functions or passes them on, thereby triggering controls or receiving measurement values.
Yes, and what you mentioned, whether you have SCADA systems, PLC, or RTUSU, HMIs, DSC, there are so many systems, and I completely agree with you. For me, my problem always is, and that's why I always try when we have such understanding questions about OT, to first look at, okay, what kind of operation it is. Is it, for example, a transportation story where there is a control center, an operation center, and so on, which has different systems? It's also super difficult for me to really make this clear distinction, OT, IT. Especially the IoT topic, which you also mentioned, feels like a buzzword bingo, determining what belongs to what. But I always say very clearly, these are the systems. They have high availability, are mostly very legacy-like, have a long lifespan, 30, 40, 50 years compared to IT systems. And as you already mentioned, they often have their own programming language or a programming medium that is not classically based on IP. They are mostly controlled via IP, but then to the sensors, to the actuators, it's their own proprietary protocol. And when we talk about protocols, the ones everyone knows are Modbus, for example, DMP3, Booknet, Profinet, and so on and so forth. These are also protocols that you often see there. And there is, yes, I believe the challenge is always there, isn't it? I also know the challenge is always there, especially when it comes to OT penetration testing, to engage with these protocols. Because one thing is that the device communicates, but you also have to understand it. And these protocols often have a huge, long process tree that you first have to understand in order to figure out what you can do with it. And For that, you need the know-how to properly examine such protocols or during a penetration test.
Yes, you're addressing a very important topic. Of course, there are numerous protocols in use. Modbus, S7 protocol, and so on. In principle, type protocols are similarly structured. That means if I can read one protocol, I know where to look and what to tackle. But the big point is each protocol is somehow unique. Each protocol also behaves differently. That means I have to at least look at this protocol structure and know what I am triggering accordingly. Because just blindly going ahead and saying, okay, there's somehow a 0 now in this parameter, and I change it to 1. I can do that, but it leads to an uncontrolled action, which I definitely don't want, because if I imagine it, I have a robot, which I can usually move quite well with 1s and 0s. But I don't know if 1 means moving forward, backward, right, or left. That means if I'm really in production with people standing around, then that's the most conceivable. The least favorable thing I can do. Of course, I could also stop the pen test at this point and say, yes, there is the corresponding protocol where I can change a 1 to a 0. I could be correspondingly critical, but as long as I can't prove what ultimately happens or how the whole thing is structured, I have a big problem, because then I'm obviously on a theoretical level. Our goal also at Pentaris Security is to show what I can do with it, how I can take over the control accordingly, and also master the control. That's why you have to deal with the protocol. And the second point, especially with proprietary protocols, is that because they have been on the market for so long, they don't have an encryption layer, or the encryption layer is somehow retrofitted on top. And then I have the big problem, which I almost always have when I retrofit something on top, and that is still the issue of availability. That means the lower layer runs through and I add something on top, some kind of encryption. One can imagine how secure the protocol is then, ultimately, because the encryption can usually be bypassed somewhere at the start or endpoint, and then speak proprietary again on the 0 level and continue sending plain text commands.
What is always important to me, and you can also share your opinion on this, is that especially in the OT area, one must not forget the topic of safety. We are talking about, as you already mentioned, robots production. No one wants that thing to go haywire. Unfortunately, there was once a case when these robots were not inside the cages. Nowadays, or many robots must, I don't remember what the D standard is called, but there are corresponding standards for this, that if you have such a robot, then the construction area, no matter where the robot can go, so really, so to speak, 360 degrees, if the robot could go 360 degrees, must be enclosed with a cage or must be shielded. It must also be designed in such a way that as soon as the door opens, meaning if someone were to enter the room, it should not start. So purely, technically, it should not start. This is now based on digital technology, but we are talking about so-called HSE systems, meaning hefty security environment systems, which ensure that in addition to the security we just discussed, safety is also guaranteed so that nothing happens. And especially with the topic of pen testing, I've often seen that people try to focus only on security. But personally, I also say you need to look at these HSE aspects to see how secure they really are. They are usually also specially certified, often doubly designed, redundant, and so on. But if I, as an attacker, manage to bypass such an HSE system in any way, then I have a much greater impact and cause much more damage. Because in the end, a human life is at stake, and I think that should not be forgotten, especially in the OT area, because of course with a computer, if I do a pen test on a computer, what can happen? Not like in Hollywood where the thing explodes and suddenly causes some damage, or there are rumors. Yes, there were also rumors back then about pages in Lebanon being triggered through a hack attack. We all know that wasn't the case, but at the end of the day, you don't really have an impact in the IT area. In the OT area, you can have a significant impact. I think you have to be careful, especially when considering doing something in the OT area. You must not forget the topic of safety. Or how do you see it?
As you said, that's a very important point. The safety line is usually outside of these IT environments. That's why it's often forgotten in pen tests. The safety line really operates on a physical level. Accordingly, it goes to the control units. That means I create electronic impulses that set a corresponding 1 or 0, which I don't necessarily do directly with the pen test. I can influence. Now, I need to know that if I have such a control unit, then I have this PLC or SPS in German, which takes over the control. Then I have so-called input and output modules, which I accordingly attach to it. If I can now exclude these modules accordingly, and the safety module is not, as it should be, connected to the primary PLC, then I would interrupt the safety or the safety line accordingly and prevent it from functioning properly. As a rule, this should generally be something that is tested, but as we know, should, would, could is not necessarily something I can rely on. Only what is actually tested counts. Therefore, at this point, of course, one should always consider safety and see how I can override or bypass it accordingly, because even with cages, there are certainly critical points on how I can bypass the whole thing. Even such a sensor can sometimes have errors, or I might also be able to get to it and manipulate it accordingly. This is also an attack path I can choose by approaching it from a different angle. That means during an OT pen test, I don't just look at this Ethernet connection, but I also go to the protocol level. I go to the mechanical level where I can see what I can do with electronic impulses. It always sounds a bit out there when you look at the whole thing, but especially during an OT pen test, when you're on the go, you might have to work with an old-fashioned oscilloscope and see what waves are happening. Beyond that, how can I influence the whole thing? What can I apply to a pulse to cause a voltage error and thereby possibly trigger a malfunction? And one aspect is, of course, what happens to the system itself, meaning truly on the physical level. The other aspect is what the operator ultimately sees, because you have to make a big distinction there as well. And you can probably confirm that from your experience. One aspect is what really happens, meaning I see a door opening and closing. The other aspect is what the operator sees. The operator might not see that the door is currently open, but instead continues to see a static image indicating that the door is closed, because I might have overlaid it, thus affecting the so-called HMI or human-machine interface. Accordingly manipulated and shows something different than what is actually the case. And we often have this problem because a manipulation protocol line where log files are written and alarms are triggered if something doesn't work, unfortunately only functions to a limited extent in this OT environment. So we often have this issue, there is somehow a log file, but when an alarm is triggered, it is only somewhere in the log protocol, because there are so many alarms that I can no longer monitor everything. And they are more of a disturbance. That's why they are then excluded, which is of course also fatal.
Yes, you are especially addressing a topic that many attackers also try. In the OT area, they try to manipulate the systems in the background, sometimes only minimally, and then simply leave the HMI. That is, the interface believing everything is normal, or I would say to display that everything is normal. There are some very well-known attacks that have proceeded exactly according to this pattern. Something was changed in the background. Afterwards, it was displayed differently. You see on the screen that everything is normal, but in fact, not everything was normal. This is a very familiar pattern to me, especially in the OT area, because you can cause the greatest possible damage with it. You can change values in the background, like pressures, speeds, or whatever. But this is not visible in the control center or to the person checking everything, and it only becomes visible when it's too late, namely when the machine has failed or there is some form of damage. And I believe that is also the danger that needs to be understood, especially in the OT area. One aspect of is what the sensors and actuators do, and the other is what is reported back. And of course, one should also consider how to secure that what is displayed to me is truly valid.
I have a completely different problem at this point, and I must return the question to you right away. Namely, what I often see is that there is no person responsible for the area, especially in the area of OT security. At least in my experience, there is no one who truly feels responsible, because IT says it's somehow a production facility. We are not responsible for that. Production says, but it has a network plug. We are not responsible for that. So how do I deal with that? And I don't know, what is your experience? In my experience, there is no real person responsible, and coming together, they don't really do that either. Yes, that's true. You really don't do that either.
Yes, unfortunately, that is indeed a big problem that I keep seeing, and I can confirm that 1000%. There are some large corporations that, for example, have already introduced a CISO in OT, but we're really talking about large corporations here, especially in medium-sized companies. This is less often the case. And what I keep seeing here, and that's also what I'm trying to address through this podcast and other activities that I keep doing, including now at the NIS2 Congress, where I will address this topic of IT versus OT again, is that you simply have a communication problem. In the end, IT and OT want the same thing. They want to protect the company from harm. She wants to grow together with the company. They want to grow together. Everyone wants that. However, IT has a different approach from a technical standpoint compared to OT. And what I keep noticing is that instead of building mutual understanding, like why do you do it this way, or why do you do it that way, or what can I learn from IT? What can I learn from OT? Instead, there's this complete attitude of I'm staying out of it. IT says, leave me alone with the OT crap. And OT says, leave me alone with the IT crap. And actually, both sides can learn a lot from each other. Of course, you can't just randomly apply patches and such on an OT, but you can, for example, address the issue of documentation, which is really a nightmare in the OT area. Most of the time, you have the system documented, and that's about it. But everything else around it is not documented at all. That's where you can learn from IT again. That means there are many areas where you can learn from each other. But what I keep seeing is that first you need to sit down together with at OT and management. And first, you need to bring everyone to the same level. Why do we do it this way and why do you do it that way? To then approach a solution together. Because that's where I keep seeing the issue. Especially in the OT area where people say, leave me alone with that crap. My system just needs to run and nothing else should be running. There are also cases, and I can't name names here, where, for example, WannaCry is still active in production today. And for the company, it's simply cheaper to have a team of 5 people who basically get up every morning, make their coffee, and check where WannaCry is active in production again. Then reinstall the computers and do the same thing all over again the next day, instead of shutting down production once, isolating WannaCry and starting fresh. For them, it's cheaper this way, and this also demonstrates the complexity for me. And this also shows me that we need to further promote this shared understanding between IT and OT at the management level, because both have many, or both topics have overlapping points with the other topic. And these need to be identified. They need to be clearly communicated. And then it works better. But clearly, as of today, it is indeed the case that it is very difficult to truly create something holistic. And I'll give you another example. A large automobile manufacturer is currently, for example, approaching their partners, and we were approached by one of them. Hey, we now have this OT security policy implemented in all your plants. And then you encounter people who have absolutely no idea about OT security. You are supposed to get them to somehow implement OT security, but they don't understand at all what I'm supposed to do there. And then you always have the problem of becoming a sort of business enabler and explaining to people why we are doing this, why it is so important, how to handle it, and what it means for me, and so on and so forth. And also understanding how these systems work, because you can't just send an IT person over and have them go to an OT person. And then you say, hey, let's have a quick chat. And in the second sentence, he already mentioned something about IP or updates. Then the OT person immediately tunes out and says, okay, I don't even need to continue talking to him because he has no idea about my stuff. And there I always see, for me, always the root of the problem is the understanding between IT and OT people. That simply needs to improve. And there are indeed ways to really learn from each other and also take things away. And if we manage that, then I believe it will also be easier to advance such security topics in OT.
But you just mentioned some very important points again, especially the topic of documentation, which I always find very interesting because it always shows me how little is documented. So of course, I know that there is a facility. I know where it communicates to, what it might still pass on to the ERP. But when you then ask, what systems do you have in production? What is all connected to it? Very few people know what they actually have. There is no asset list or anything like that, as is also required in IT.
Let's start by asking for a software bill of materials from the OT area. Good luck with that. It will never happen. And I think the problem here is simply that people are very focused on their facility. I now have, for example, a Siemens system with an S7, with an HMI, and whatever else goes with it. Then I have documented this system because I need it to supply the supplier. In this case, for example, Siemens or any third-party provider. But what happens around this system, I have documented nowhere.
Yes, so that's one thing. And the other is, of course, if I now see the UT network as a whole network, then the system is naturally just a small part. And then it is often forgotten that I suddenly include devices in this UT network that have no place there because the network exists. After all, I can include them accordingly. It has to run accordingly. It is in a certain way also part of the production. We have also had this with customers where some cleaning robots, for example, those that clean the hall, are simply included in the OT network. And no one knows how these robots work. And this only came out by chance because we said we need to do an asset discovery and find out what devices you actually have in production. And at this point, as an analyst, I have to proceed very carefully when analyzing because I can only do so passively. Observe who is in there. That means I am not allowed to actively query the system and say, hey, who are you actually? But instead I have to go searching. And that was indeed such a huge topic where we said, yes, where does all this come from? What is happening there? We actually stumbled upon it by chance because the system also set up a Wi-Fi, and through Wi-Fi measurement, we were able to find out which device it was. But it always showed me again, okay, a robot has just been bought. It has to run in production, so it belongs in the OT network, so it gets put in there. However, the system actually cannot communicate with any of the facilities, and it shouldn't because it's just some Chinese robot running around there. That somehow gets neglected in the whole process. And I encounter that very often in production.
But I think we have the problem again here. There is no clear definition of what OT really is. And as you already mentioned, you just throw something in that doesn't really fit with IT or somehow fits with IoT. But the problem we also have, and you know this too, is this blending between OT and IT towards IoT or IoT or whatever the new buzzword will be called now. So what I mean by that is that the separation between OT and IT is becoming increasingly blurred. So it's also in the nature of wanting to do things like predictive maintenance, wanting to conduct more analysis, wanting to work more with your data, wanting to offer value-added services with some digitalization features. This means that in the end, this mix between OT and IT, I don't want to say it will disappear, but it will become increasingly blurred between each other. And I believe that the big challenge for companies is to really think about how I can ensure that I can still operate my core, so to speak, my production facility safely, while also keeping up with competitors, digitalization, and all the various topics that come with it, which I need, right? So I need to become digital or more digital. And thus, I have to open up my facility to some extent in some form, right? There are various methods for this. We could already create a podcast just about what can be done there. But I believe that this is, so to speak, now. The current challenge for all companies is to think about how I can, so to speak, expand my OT network in order to stay competitive in the market, or let's say adapt to the market with digitalization, with predictive maintenance, and so on and so forth. And there are already, in my opinion, major mistakes happening. That you simply open up the network completely or start thinking about it and say, okay, come on, then we just need it like this. Then we have to deal with it this way now. And that's exactly the topic for me again. OT pen test. It is also good to say, okay, how can I open my network? And if I have opened my network in some way, how secure is the whole thing?
Yes, but that's the point again. What you're addressing now, I'm approaching it with the wrong mindset because I'm naturally applying this IT perspective to it. I have the IT glasses on and say, okay, my system needs to have software updates somehow. My system, we need a scanner for that. No, you don't need that. In OT, there are completely different approaches to securing a network. I can look at the protocol level accordingly and restrict it. I can restrict communication paths to one-way communication and so on. But I have to deal with the topic. And that's also the big point why we say the pen test in and of itself. It does reveal many gaps on one side, but on the other side, it also provides you with measures, because alongside the pen test, we also advise in the area of how to implement something securely. How do you implement such measures? How do I also build a concept so that the whole thing is effective, so that I can appropriately separate these systems, ensuring they are distinct? And then I can also, in a second step, check again if the whole thing works better now. What does it look like when I have implemented the whole thing accordingly or not? And what are the measures? And maybe also at that point, and just so you know, how you can further educate yourself, how you can even enter this field. We also offer a corresponding OT training in this area where exactly this is practiced, where you look at how such a thing works at all, how such an attack functions, and how I can secure it. and what advantages this security actually has. And that is a very important point because many simply do not know where they should turn to. They say, I have to do it through IT. They have to deal with it. And that is the completely wrong approach, to go and simply post a job and say, I am now looking for someone who does OT security. Even if I have all the money in the world, I won't really find many who are willing to say, I'll go there, because there isn't that much specialized personnel who are knowledgeable about OT security, let alone willing to switch and join a corresponding company. And I find it all the more interesting that especially the big players in the market are now all going and saying they are doing OT pen tests. Yes, it may be that they have someone, but and in itself, the industry in this area is very small and people know each other. So it's not like I have like IT specialists as plentiful as sand on the beach.
Yes, I agree with you there. But the problem for a company is also, as I keep saying, and that's also a reason why I'm doing this podcast, to showcase people like you here and say, hey, listen to him because I know he has the know-how and he understands it too. For a company, it gets a marketing slide, it gets a presentation, and it has no idea about OT security itself. How is it supposed to decide whether it's right or wrong? That's also a problem. So not just with OT security, but with all security topics. And aside from that, we all know security is not black and white. There are many ways you can do it. One way might be slower. Another way might be faster. Another way might cost more. Another way might cost less. So there are many ways there too. And in the OT area, as you just mentioned, I find it extremely important to do more to ensure that the people working in the OT area, the commissioning personnel, the plant operators, or those involved with the topic are also given some knowledge about security. Because I agree with you. Training an IT person in OT is significantly more difficult than teaching an OT person about security. I've done this in various courses, whether it's at the VDI or other institutes. I've conducted these courses on IT versus OT or how to become an OT security expert. And it's always some IT people who are sent there with the attitude of, oh, we have an OT and you need to do something about it. And then I always say, folks, you first need to have a basic understanding of OT. Then you can start talking about it. And this includes topics like sensors, actuators, measurement and control systems. What is an RTO? What is a PLC? And so on and so forth. You need to understand that first. You also need to understand the topic of availability, which we've already talked about. These are all things you need to understand. And then you also need to have the specific information about the system, whether it's a Siemens, a Phoenix Contact, or a Shodan Electronics, or whatever system it is. There are differences again. So the problem is not that you imagine OT as if everything is the same. No, because OT means, as you said at the beginning, they are very specialized systems, which are usually also very specifically maintained by the manufacturer. Whether it's a proprietary programming language or a unique system behind it, you need this know-how as well. So you don't just need the overall know-how, but you also need the know-how of what my specific system, which I have in use, can do. And then it becomes difficult. And I believe companies need to invest more in this. Invest in OT specialists, invest in security. And the IT specialists and OT specialists need to be brought to a common understanding or a common ground so that it is better understood. And it doesn't fail because security doesn't implemented simply because the right contact person wasn't found or everyone is just standing in front of a wall and say, I don't want to.
So what makes the whole topic significantly more difficult from my perspective at the moment, and also greatly pushes the attacks, is that there is a lot circulating now, like the Flipper Zero or other things, where even lay people are suddenly dealing with the topic of OT, but have no connection to it. What am I causing with it? Because the Flipper Zero is, of course, a great tool that I can use and is also a mega toy because I can open door locks, I can do things somewhere, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, whatever, send everything there. I can send a SIP protocol, which I naturally use in home automation, but I can also cause significant damage with it. Because this topic also showed me, for example, that the power supplies, i.e. the current adapters, are now equipped with a corresponding radio protocol. Of course, I don't necessarily get into the area, but I can simply read a configuration because it might have just been laid over it somehow. I can load a configuration. I can do all of this with the Flipper Zero. where I have to say if a layperson is already at the level where they can load something and intervene so extremely, like adjusting a power supply up and down, changing voltages, that's not necessarily the best thing I can do in production. I can quickly cause some damage where I don't really know how to proceed. And that makes the whole thing extremely vulnerable. And that is also what makes the whole topic relatively difficult from my perspective. A lot of fear is being used here because I have a Flipper Zero and look how easy it is. I can just download, upload, and the production is ready. Yeah, that may always look nice. I mean, we also do that in live hacking to show a bit, okay, it could be this easy. But it also fuels a fear that doesn't necessarily need to be there, because there are mechanisms to secure the whole thing. From that point, you have to move away a bit and make the whole thing more concrete and show what does it really look like in the facility? What is the actual company context? Because the fact that I can do something like that is beyond question if I can access this network. But there are also hurdles that prevent me from accessing the network.
And we both know there are much easier ways to start a company than using a Flipper Zero. If you just look at the topic of physical security, which isn't even the focus today, that's a topic you could also talk about for hours. Then you realize that especially with critical infrastructure, you can achieve your goals much faster and easier with physical security than by trying to use a Flipper Zero. But I think to get back to the topic of pentesting, because we're digressing a bit, but I still find it good, and to emphasize the point you made, which I always find super important, especially in this topic of fear, that's also a topic close to my heart. I finally want to move away from this topic of fear. But such things also help with these fear drivers, like Shodan, for example. Everyone always says, hey, use Shodan. And then you find so many industrial plants, so many things that you can attack. There were many solar plants and wind turbines, and so on and so forth. Here, I would also like to make a case for it. I also use Shodan from time to time in life hacks. But I actually always use the topic of surveillance cameras, because for me, it's just clearer. Because you have a result, you see an image, and it also shows that it concerns private matters. With Shodan, however, it is actually the case, and you can also share your opinion on this, that according to my definition, many entries, especially those related to production, are all sandbox stories or honeypots. So I don't actually see on Shodan anymore, as it used to be, the huge production facilities or the big problems. But a lot, especially when it comes to production facilities, are really honeypots that have been set up to catch attackers. And that's not the image one should really paint in their mind to say, oh dear, there are now so many millions of open facilities. Yes, they certainly do exist, but personally, coming from the industry, I can't quite understand what one sees on Shodan. How do you see it?
It is indeed the case that there are a lot of honeypots out there, at least in the German-speaking area. In other countries, it looks a bit different when I look at the USA, and especially China and the surrounding areas. There, the systems are still as accessible as they were back then with us. But otherwise, the accessibility of systems has significantly decreased. So I sometimes find systems where I used to find several thousand systems. Now I might find 100 at most. And there is indeed a trend towards honeypots. However, it must be said that the honeypot systems are still like that. They are already very conspicuously designed. So they are usually marked by Shodan as well. There are still a few that don't fall into that category. But yes, as you say, there are indeed some points that can be very well utilized, especially from abroad. Because when it comes to Shodan, it's not about showing, okay, these are the facilities, and now I have one and can tackle it. But it's more about raising awareness of what can happen if I don't consider the issue at all, if I don't look at how I set up such a network externally without looking further into it. And I recently used it when I was at the Surgeons Congress, just to show how one can use a DICOM interface, for example, to access image material. Of course, there aren't many in Germany, but in the USA, for example, the DICOM connections are still all open, accessible. And then I can access all the X-ray images and so on.
Good point. That was a sentence I should have included.
Don't look any further. And I recently used it when I was at the Surgeons Congress, just to show how one can use a DICOM interface, for example, to access image material. Of course, there aren't many in Germany, but in the USA, for example, the DICOM connections are still publicly accessible. and then I can access all the X-ray images.
Good point. That was a sentence I should have included. In Germany. Above all, I see mobile pods. You're absolutely right. Abroad, it's still like that. And I also believe that this awareness is important, but what is always my heartfelt topic is that approaching it with fear doesn't help. Yes, we have the topic, and I always use Showdown to demonstrate that this information exists and what can be done with this information. But one shouldn't always imagine it as it's often portrayed in Hollywood. I can now access any nuclear power plant via gravel feeling. It requires a bit more know-how and some different approaches to actually be able to do something like that. And that's again this fear faction where I clearly say it always leads to us closing our eyes and doing nothing. But well, let's get back a bit to the topic of pen testing, what I would still be interested in, and I believe it also creates interest for the listeners. Super interesting. What phases do you see in OT pen testing? Or are they more the same phases for you as in IT pen testing?
So are they the same phases? No, definitely not. Of course, there are certain similarities that can be observed. First of all, in OT pen testing, you have to differentiate the whole thing a bit. We generally start an OT pen test unless I begin with social engineering and want to see how access to the company itself is achieved on the network level, because that is the most important level. In the OT area, I somehow get into the OT network through network segmentation. How are OT and IT separated from each other? What communication interfaces exist between them? How can I possibly jump over this network segmentation? I usually leave this point a bit aside in the IT network, because there I am given a system. I am given a network in which I operate. OT actually starts for me at that point already. That means I first look at what is possible there, what interfaces exist. When I then proceed and say, okay, now I really consider it purely this OT network, then I naturally have to go through the individual layers, because the OT network should generally be so well segmented that I have different layers accordingly, different phases accordingly, and have also micro-segmented the whole thing very well.
And the real world simply looks like this. Everything is in the same network.
I was just about to say there is a nice big flat network. It makes it very easy for an attacker, because then I can simply address all systems. Of course, I still have the layers. So the normal field levels, I can't change anything about them. As an operator, which is also good, that means I at least have this gradation. I have a sensor and an actuator down here. Above that comes my control unit, then comes the HMI, and only after that comes the network level, which is of course quite a good separation. That means I can't usually speak directly to the actuator from this Ethernet cable. And that's always the first thing you look at accordingly. What kind of OT firewalls do I have in use, which might also secure the PLC again against the entire remaining network, because I actually have this transition there as well. And that's actually the level that I look at from a network perspective. But if I really push the OT test further, then I also have to look at the systems themselves. That means I also go and ask, where is the PLC located? How is it connected? What kind of interfaces do I have behind it? What can I do with such devices? PLC is just an example. There are also other chips that I can use there, of course. What possibilities do I have to flash a firmware there? What possibilities do I have to communicate via an interface accordingly? Perhaps also to provide me with additional interfaces available through a so-called JTAG or other interfaces where I can ultimately, or a UART interface where I can ultimately also establish communication with the device itself and perhaps communicate on a programming or configuration level to ultimately adjust parameters and then provoke faulty behavior and ultimately also trigger faulty behavior. Beyond that, of course, I also have in the OT environment what is also used in a classic pen test, software applications running on it that are vulnerable to corresponding protocols. I can usually test these a bit more rigorously because they are detached. But this is also a very important point, because I see this again and again, which also brings us back to the initial topic. There are too many companies offering this coming from the IT environment. The first question that always comes up is there somehow a test infrastructure? We only test on the test infrastructure. Yes, that would be nice, right? I also prefer testing on a test infrastructure rather than a live environment, but ultimately, hardly anyone can afford a second production just so I can conduct a pen test.
Yes. I actually don't know any customer who spends a few million on a test environment. What you do see sometimes are really like that virtual time environments But with virtual ones, as the word already suggests, you always have the problem that it's just not the replica of the live environment. And it's always difficult to really conduct a pen test in such a way that you can say, watch out, it's equivalent for the live environment.
You just can't adapt it particularly well. Of course, we also have many systems where the customer tells us, here you have a single device, you can take it completely apart. Especially when it's interesting, yes, then I can take a closer look at the PLC. Then I can closely examine the hardware responsible for door opening or other functions. Whether the whole thing then also works in the real environment, that has to be verified again, because the test environment, it naturally has completely different parameters, completely different interactions because I always have to take that into account. In the OT environment, I have many external influences that play a role, which can ultimately produce something there, and I always have to take those into account as well. And that is often somewhat overlooked, even when I conduct individual test systems. Then I see, the system is super vulnerable. It's very critical. I must shut down production immediately. No, I don't have to. The system can be as critical as it wants. It can have as many vulnerabilities as it wants. If the whole thing is securely embedded in the environment, then I don't need to worry about it at all. Yes, then it appears in the test, but that's just what we often see. And where I have to say, where we also get quite good feedback from the customer, that we don't just go and say, oh, the system has outdated software, therefore you're completely out, but rather an evaluation of the company itself takes place, where you can ultimately say the system might be insecure, but the overall impact on the company is relatively low because everything has been securely implemented.
Perhaps another interesting question, also exciting for the audience, because you can kind of gauge, is this the right one? Is this the wrong one? Spilling the beans a bit, what tools do you use in OT pen testing? I already mentioned at the beginning, if someone comes to you and says, I'm doing OT pen testing, for example, with Nmap, I would be very cautious. Of course, you can use Nmap in the OT area, but you have to use the right parameters. So above all, don't run a sharp Nmap, because then everything might just crash. But maybe a few tools where you say, hey, these are common tools that can also be used in the OT area. And maybe also for some listeners, and a feature or an indication that this company might have delved more into the topic, perhaps more than another company.
That's again such a big point. What tools do we use? Of course, we also use Nmap. Actually, I'm not supposed to say that, because if I say I use Nmap in the OT environment, then I know exactly that everyone will say, he just said you can use Nmap, so I'll do it. No, the most important thing is that I work with appropriate timing delays to avoid causing any outages, to also get results back accordingly. Otherwise, I always have to make sure that I proceed very passively. That means I have to do passive listening. Of course, I can use tools like Wireshark to look at the protocols and see what's running there. It must be said that I also have to spend a bit more time dealing with it in an OT environment. That means I have to plan for a larger time investment, even if it's just reading protocols. For this, Wireshark is indeed used, which ultimately serves to evaluate the protocol, to see what is being communicated, how the individual parameters act, and to further dissect them. And I also have to deal a lot with these documentation levels, because, for example, what do I include in such a protocol? What is stated in my instructions? Maybe also, can I read something from it that ultimately happens? This is another topic that has come up, but we can say a few words about it shortly. Regarding this ESP32 microchip, which has undocumented interfaces, I have to say again, yes, this is a vector. It needs to be examined. Of course, we also investigate such things, but I really have to look at it closely, because simply saying per se that it's undocumented and looks like a vector, I can do that, but it is then very unfounded. Therefore, if there is indeed something to it, it is a huge vulnerability that can be exploited. And that's what ultimately needs to be done, to find out what communicates there, where to, what do the individual parameters do, and how is it triggered. Otherwise, we have a lot of self-written protocols or tools that ultimately rely on the results of the protocols. That means for the Modbus, for the S7 accordingly as well, how do I communicate there? What can I address there? In principle, one could also say, if you will, it's like a Wireshark, and I then send out the Wireshark commands again. So the tools don't really do anything different than nicely packaging the whole thing and then discussing the protocol language.
I think it's important to mention again here, Especially in OT pen testing, you are dependent on which system you are pen testing. Whether you are pen testing Siemens, Phoenix, or whatever, there are different methods and possibilities to do that. It's not quite like in the IT sector where you just run a Nessus scanner and then everything is fine. That doesn't really work. There are, of course, now products that can also be used for OT. I'm always a fan of nothing active. Maybe you remember the discussion we had back at the old company where many customers said, yes, but I want an active IDS IPS in the OT area so I can do something there. And back then we advised all customers against it because it can lead to situations, especially in the OT area, where something actually happens that never happened before but is still important for production. And then you have a tool that actively intervenes and disrupts your entire production, which doesn't work either. I see the same thing in the pen testing area. Primarily use passive tools. These tools gather information passively and do nothing active because when actively gathering information or querying active components, it is more likely that such devices will fail.
But that is also a very important point. If I collect information passively, I also need to analyze it because this is often neglected. I collect information passively by not having any reaction to it. This means I don't have an IPS that ultimately prevents everything, but I only get an alert that something has happened. I need to take a closer look at this alert and actually assess whether it is something critical or not, and then respond accordingly because this is often neglected. I have an alert somewhere that is triggered. Yes. It hasn't happened very often so far, so it should be fine. Then the whole thing is waved through. If I don't have an IPS, and I usually don't in production, then I should take a closer look at such things and also question, does it have to be? Where is it communicating to? What is the whole thing doing? Do I need it? And then I can take appropriate measures and say, okay, I can allow it for now, but I will monitor it very restrictively and see what happens next. Because otherwise I'm exactly at the point, and then I'm, as far as you said at the beginning, that I have a wanna try in there, and I just restore a backup every time and I'm a day behind. Just to keep production running, I don't want that. And I can prevent that in time.
Yes. Now there's an exciting question for me, but because this, of course, often comes from this IT area when you then have to deal with OT. Manufacturer Froede, would you prefer to do a black box pen test or a white box pen test? So I already know the answer, but I always find it exciting when a company approaches you and says, oh, OT pen test, yeah, please black box. We do the same in the IT sector.
Honestly, my answer is actually, of course, I would prefer to do a black box pen test. It's not possible in the OT environment, of course, but I also don't want to do a pure white box pen test in the OT environment. Why? When I look at everything in a white box manner, I'm very limited in my perspective because then I see there are interfaces, there is a connection. I focus on these parts that I really see and neglect potentially other parts that I wouldn't neglect in a black box test because I have a completely different perspective. That's why, yes, a pure black box test is absolutely out of the question for OT. I need information about what lies behind where something communicates. However, I want to keep this information very minimal, at least at the beginning, to come up with attack scenarios myself and approach it more openly. Before I play through such scenarios, I should thoroughly think through the theory again and see if I can really do it that way. Can I apply it? And then I tend to move away from this tray box approach and also head towards white box. What is behind it? What would happen? And our approach is actually to envision attack scenarios, verify them, and only after verification actually carry out these attacks. That means performing the final exploitation and confirming what would happen then, what would happen to the system. Of course, not playing out the worst case scenario to the end, because stopping a system or possibly bringing it to a certain state that is also possible, irreparable, meaning to crash a PLC to the point where it no longer runs, is of course the worst case that we do not want. And we said at the beginning, production has systems that are sometimes 30 years old. I can't get a spare part for them, meaning I would somehow have to buy a new production facility just because I managed to bring down the system completely into idle mode.
That's why I also recommend every company dealing with the topic of OT pen testing to pay close attention to whether the pen tester has good insurance. So actually, It sounds quite marginal, but especially in the OT area, I have to say very clearly, and this is also a recommendation I always give to each of our customers, make sure that the pen testers have appropriately high insurance. Because as you just said, if the pen tester makes a mistake or something happens, it doesn't always necessarily have to be the pen tester's fault. We don't always want to look for the scapegoat with the pen tester. But at the end of the day, if you have a production outage, need to replace hardware or whatever, then in the OT area, we're quickly talking about millions. We're not always talking about 1,000 euros, but very quickly about 1 million. If such a robot fails, then you have a very high sum. And that's why, especially when you have a pen tester in that area, you must always ensure that there is a correspondingly high coverage amount. For example, we have secured every pen test with 10 million as a standard. There are just various things like that. I just want to mention it because I see time and again that people don't think about it. A pen test can also destroy something. In their heart, every pen tester actually wants to destroy something. Let's put it that way. So they do want to get to the reins in the end. But the classic pen test is not really about destroying something, but about highlighting it and saying, watch out, something is happening here. However, in the OT area, it can happen that something gets destroyed. And for that, you need insurance that will cover it in case of doubt.
And at this point, perhaps also the note that a cyber insurance is quite good, but it does not replace a pen test, because we often encounter the issue where it's repeatedly said, yes, we now have cyber insurance, we don't need a pen test anymore, everything is taken care of. Yes, it's nice to have it because it does help in an emergency. You should still conduct a pen test and accordingly know what systems you have, because it's always a good prerequisite to know what I have in use, where things are going, and what could happen in an emergency.
Let's continue talking. We have already started talking a bit about attack scenarios or also about the exploits. Let's take remote maintenance access as a classic example. A very common topic, especially in the OT area. What is your experience with what goes wrong most often there, and why it is always a common attack scenario to target a company in OT?
Remote maintenance access is indeed still the classic that many are familiar with, like TeamViewer. I don't know why, but in production, it has somehow become common practice for production facilities to have a TeamViewer session that is permanently active, which I can connect to. It might be relatively simple from the manufacturer's side. I have easy maintenance access. I have full access to the machine. I can simply navigate there. From the perspective of a plant operator, it's naturally the least favorable situation I could have, because anyone can connect to it. How can I really ensure that it's the manufacturer? Why isn't it a hacker connecting who might also see this TeamViewer session? Because I can see it from the outside. I can number the ID. I can try to connect to it accordingly, because the passwords are usually not chosen to be extremely complex, especially in the production environment, so that I also have remote maintenance access to these systems. And I also don't have a 4 eyes principle, which I should definitely ensure for remote maintenance access in production, so that only the person who is supposed to access can actually do so.
I completely agree with you on that. What I have also repeatedly seen there is,
because I can see them from the outside. I can enumerate the ID, I can try to connect to it accordingly, because the passwords are usually not chosen to be extremely complex, especially in the production environment, so that I also have remote maintenance access to these systems. And I also don't have a 4 eyes principle, which I should definitely ensure for remote maintenance access in production, so that only those who are supposed to access can actually do so.
I completely agree with you on that. What I have, also repeatedly seen is the issue, Matsi, not only concerning security, but also the traceability of what happens on these systems. Because we see it more and more often, supply chain attacks are increasing, and it doesn't always necessarily have to be an attack. It can also be an unconscious change to the system, an unconscious configuration change. And I also need to think about how I can ensure that when someone accesses my systems, I know what is happening there. Because I have seen time and again in the past that changes have been made both knowingly and unknowingly, and suddenly no one knew who did it or why it happened, but the system was no longer functioning properly.
Yes, that's also a very important point. I can also say from experience, we've had this issue before. We conducted a corresponding penetration test on a production system. Everything was labeled as, yes, a penetration test is currently being conducted, so all changes to the system are due to the penetration test. That was not the case. Someone else, I assume some manufacturer, made changes in parallel that no one knew about. I have to say that's obviously a very critical point, because making changes to a system without informing anyone, I usually do that once. After that, there should immediately be a lock on it, because a system manufacturer should not allow anyone onto the system just like that. No one should be allowed to make any changes without me knowing about it, because that obviously also significantly affects the availability of the systems. And that's also a point where I have to say we at Pentests are very diligent about ensuring that when we conduct tests somewhere, we register beforehand and say we are conducting a test. From this time to that time, and even during the test phase, we coordinate everything precisely and also provide IP addresses. System manufacturers usually do not do this. Things are just done on the side. A patch is applied somewhere. Sometimes patches are still sent via USB stick.
Especially for us, in the professional community of pen testers, it's actually the case that we always have one foot in jail. Because due to the hacker paragraph in Germany, a pen test, if you look at it from a legal standpoint, is simply a criminal offense. So that shouldn't be forgotten either. I know the government wanted to change that now. I also don't know if it has been changed in the meantime. But if you take a look at it, even with a clean bill of health, is that legitimate? From a legal standpoint, is a pen test a criminal offense?
I have to say too much. I'm not that far in legal terms, what, where, how. That's why we don't conduct pen tests, but rather active security analyses. These are then allowed again, because ultimately we want to improve the security of the systems.
I also think, I don't know of any case where something really happened, because it is indeed used for positive purposes. Of course, naturally there are also, like everywhere, black sheep. And then it's also good to have something like that. But I also believe that no one would actively want to condemn someone who is conducting an officially commissioned pen test. But now we've briefly strayed from the topic again. Another topic that interests me, I also think it's super exciting for the community. Now we've talked a lot about sensors and actuators. Yes, always, the lovely field level. How do you see it there? What attack scenarios are there? So what? Are these typical attacks that you can have on sensors and actuators?
Indeed, a question that is very difficult to assess, because I naturally have very different sensors and actuators in the environment. Do I always have to really focus on the individual environment, tailor it? What can I ultimately do then? For example, we recently had an analysis of a dosimeter where it was really about measuring radioactive radiation. There, of course, I'm in an area of influence where I can very effectively act on an actuator, because what happens if I now simulate radiation that isn't actually present? That means I really go there and also simulate false values, input false parameters that don't work accordingly. Otherwise, a classic use case that many probably know is the topic of traffic analysis by Google. All the phones that I, for example, pack into wheelbarrows and drive around somewhere, that's also a simple manipulation of an actuator, if you will, which ultimately takes these measurements. And with that, I can artificially cause traffic jams. There are many such topics, but I actually have to focus on the environment itself.
So what I always find difficult with sensors and actuators, and this is also a topic where I say the company might need to consider a strategy, is always the question of who is the manufacturer of such sensors and actuators. Because you know yourself, in the OT area, especially with sensors and actuators, these are not always global corporations, but sometimes it's just the garage around the corner where someone has developed a cool sensor that is now being used, which let's say is addressed via IP or through another product. That means there's no multinational dollar corporation behind it, but simply, let's say, the garage tinkerer. And I see this again and again, especially in the OT area, that the market, especially, let's say, regarding the field level, is so enormously large, also with so many small companies, that one really has to think about it. Is precisely this sensor, this actuator, the system that I am using, and is it just that? Also, security by design, which we always talk about, it must be security by design, or is it just a system where I can think about it in parallel, for example, ensuring that a firmware cannot be changed, that it cannot be accessed from there, and so on and so forth. There are various methods, and that's really what I always bring up when the topic of sensors and actuators arises, that one must always think about this, about their supply chain and also the manufacturer corresponding to these sensors and actuators.
Above all, one should not cut costs in the wrong place, because even this topic has a quality controller. I don't need a big camera. It doesn't have to be high resolution. So I order one from Amazon from China. Yes, the idea is quite good, but the implementation is usually rather poor because it's also connected to the whole network and has a backdoor. Then suddenly I've made the whole system, which might have been secure before, insecure again. Or I save on USB ports, for example, by saying I only need a charging port and just turn the power on and off. I think you know what I'm talking about. And then I transmit a data protocol accordingly. That makes the whole thing. The USB port issue becomes vulnerable again. I can, of course, definitely execute an attack through it and regain remote access.
Then let's briefly talk about protective measures and backpress at the end. We've now talked about what OT is. How do you conduct OT penetration tests? What are the experiences like? And when I always talk about protective measures, one topic you've already mentioned, for me, segmentation is a very important topic. We know an example, you were also there at the time. A large transport company was affected by WannaCry. And the problem with WannaCry back then was simply that all components in this network were on the same level. The component was with the other component, with the component all in the same network. Thus, WannaCry had an easy time, so to speak. It basically swept through the entire network. I also see this often, especially in the OT area, when we look at systems, that the system itself is already segmented. But when we see it as a big whole picture, as you also mentioned, indeed, there is no segmentation present. Would you say that this is definitely a protective measure that can be easily implemented?
Definitely, although simple is relative here. Network segmentation always sounds simple at first, but it is, of course, a highly complex system, especially in an OT environment. However, it is also what provides the most security and should be one of the first things I set up. So network segmentation is at the top of our list. After that, of course, restrict remote access so that I know who is accessing it and have a log of these remote accesses. And the third topic, which is also right at the forefront, is documentation. That means I need to be informed about my assets, which I have within the OT network and, of course, also in the IT network, because unfortunately, there are still some who are not informed. And I should clearly have an asset owner, meaning someone responsible who feels connected to this facility and says, okay, this is my domain. And I engage with the people accordingly and ensure that this facility is operated safely. So these are the three measures where I can say I need to fundamentally engage with them first. I should implement them. Then I am in a good position to make further progress accordingly. And the first thing I should do, of course, is to train the OT staff so that they know what works, where everything fits in, and what IT means in the OT environment. How important all of this is, because this is a topic that will not stop overnight. On the contrary, it will only increase. Therefore, this is the next topic after these three measures to implement as well. In what order I approach it now? I would say it depends. It always depends a bit on the company itself, but then I have the first basic measure accordingly carried out and can say I have at least dealt with the topic of OT security and have done the most necessary things.
One more exciting question to conclude, because I have already received some very interesting answers to this, and I'm curious to hear what you have to say about it. We briefly talked about what you do at the beginning, and you also mentioned the topic that it's not just about pen testing, but it also helps, especially in the area of awareness or in the area when the damage is already done, namely incident response. What is your view on incident response in the OT area? Because the problem I often see, or the challenge I often encounter, is that there's a strong attempt to adapt things directly from the IT sector to adopt them one-to-one. And that doesn't work at all in the OT area, because let's say forensics and the like, it's nice, it interests the OT area, but not the production at all. We've already seen it with the example of WannaCry at the large automobile manufacturer, which is still dealing with WannaCry. That means securing evidence is not necessarily the highest priority in the OT area. Nevertheless, one should consider a strategy or have a partner who can help in the incident response area, even in the OT area, because certain things can be implemented there.
That's correctly pointed out. Forensics is not the first thing we conduct. The highest goal we have is to ensure that the company returns to safe operations. Safe in the sense that, yes, I could theoretically let malware run in isolation somewhere. It can keep running continuously. As long as it cannot spread, it's unpleasant, but at least it allows me to continue working. This means the primary goal in incident response in the OT environment is to gradually get production back online. This means if the production itself is affected, if the control systems are affected, then I must of course clean them up and get them into an isolated area. For that, I need to thoroughly engage with the issue. This means we look at which processes need to run in what order so that I can resume as much productive work as possible in the respective company. And then I gradually bring all the employees, clients, and so on back in. Typically, an ISO zone is introduced where I scan the systems and ensure that the relevant systems are brought back in. And then I can still look at what further measures, forensic analyses, and so on I can carry out. Usually, there aren't many special cases in OT regarding attacks where I have to completely rethink each time, but rather it's always the same patterns that stand out to me. That means I also know where to intervene to be able to quickly become productive again, and also to see where the data is going. The other big issue that many companies don't really address is what happens when the data is gone. Because that's such a big topic. Most companies assume, okay, I've received a demand, I have to pay a ransom. So I'd rather pay the ransom because then my data is always behind the data. Then published. That's usually not the case. The data is still published, and hardly any company deals with this scenario until it actually happens. Yet I have many opportunities and plenty of time beforehand to address the issue and to say, hey, the data will eventually come online. What do I do then? And that's just a point that I see much earlier where I say you better engage with it. With the topics, let the appropriate systems be our problem, or rather that of IT. They can take care of the matters accordingly. Please take care of how it appears externally, how we communicate the whole thing, how we handle the incident, showing that, okay, I learned something from the incident. We want to work with it accordingly. Because the worst thing I can do in incidents is to generally say, yes, it didn't happen to us. We didn't have an incident at all, and try to sweep it under the rug. Really actively deal with the issues, and on the contrary, even use the whole thing to show, hey, this happened to us, it can happen to you too. Please take care of it beforehand, think about it in advance. And these are the measures we have now implemented to make everything safe. That you also proactively engage with other companies and show them opportunities. How can you position yourself accordingly and also make progress?
So, and now really the very last question. We talked about this beforehand, and I find it super exciting to hear your comment on it again. We currently have a topic that everyone is talking about, ESP32 security vulnerability. Billions of devices are affected by it, those that have this Bluetooth chip installed. What is your opinion on this? For me personally, I see it again as a bit of a situation where at the beginning, this topic was very hyped and people immediately said, oh dear, what's going to happen now? And didn't you see? And we have to do something now. And all chip manufacturers or everyone using this chip must update it, because it was eventually realized that no, updating isn't that simple. You would have to desolder the thing, solder in a new one, and so on and so forth. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, my initial thoughts were awesome. There's finally a vulnerability that can be used everywhere and is immediately on the system. But that's actually the first impulse when you read the headlines without delving deeper into it. That's exactly the problem. It's again this issue of instilling fear where there might not be any. Because if you take a closer look at the whole thing and read all the articles about it, you realize that from the initial impression of, okay, you can send things via Bluetooth and suddenly have remote access to the systems, you can change all the parameters, you can interact with the network settings and so on. That's not the case at all. Instead, the whole issue has been scaled back significantly. You need to have physical access, you need to have the appropriate privileged rights, and then you might be able to trigger something. This is always the point. You really need to delve deeper into it. I assume the first point was simply, yes, there were undocumented areas within this chip protocol, which was then noticeable. It was investigated further, and it looked like a backup. That's why the whole thing was published like that. You always have to replicate such issues. And that's also the first thing we said. We just take such a chip and see what's possible and verify these things ourselves, because only then can I be sure of what I can do with it and how far I can apply the whole thing. Because it's always nice when it's written somewhere. And in theory, it looks quite simple. In practice, it often turns out that it's not that simple. Connect via Bluetooth and then I can do the whole thing, but there's much more to it. And I have to specifically deal with that, of course. So from that perspective, yes, I should keep an eye on such things. Yes, I should also track such messages and follow them accordingly. But no, I shouldn't immediately panic and say, okay, I have to do something right away and throw everything out immediately, because We've had cases where someone said there has been an attack, there's some vulnerability that I can't resolve. So rip out the system, put in a new one, problem solved. I can do that. In production, it's usually not very sensible, and especially also knee-jerk reactions that aren't necessary.
You're actually saying exactly the right word, knee-jerk reaction. The press went overboard and the topic of fear-mongering came up again, and we need to do something quickly now. And I believe the right approach here was to first look at what it really is. Then there were some security researchers who took another look at it. As you said, some things were revised again. And in the end, you have to specifically see what it really means. Do I even have access to these devices via Bluetooth? Or do I really need to have the chip physically? Which is, I would say, unpleasant, but still an additional hurdle. And this shows everywhere in security, first take a good look at it. Analyze, evaluate, and then make the decision. But Sebastian, I definitely enjoyed doing this podcast with you today. I think we definitely delved deep into the topic. So both OT and OT pen testing. For that, I thank you. Of course, all the links to you and your newly founded company can be found in the info box. As I said, I can only speak from personal opinion, and this is not an advertisement. I've known Sebastian for several years. I've worked with him repeatedly, and I know he's a super cool guy who especially has the technical know-how. And as you already mentioned, he also enjoys advising people, because I believe one thing is to conduct a pen test, and the other is really to present the report in an understandable way and also to explain it to people, because I see that time and again. And this is independent of IT or OT. Then a 50-page long pen test report comes out and the customer is like, here you go, and do with it what you will. And I know that it's different with you. And therefore, I'm glad that you joined us here on the podcast today, answered the questions, and we could discuss the topic together. It was a personal pleasure for me. And with that, I would say that was it for this episode of Cybersecurity Chefsage, the podcast. And we'll hear and see each other next time. See you then.
Thank you, Nico, for the invitation. I also really enjoyed talking with you about the whole topic. In general, it's a very important topic, as you already mentioned. Of course, we try to be active in the OT area as well, conducting the pen tests. But we are also equally willing to provide consulting. That means don't hesitate to just get in touch and find out what's actually possible or where one can start. Because that's the point where most people don't even begin. And they say, yes, it all costs too much money. I don't even want a pen test. Let's just talk about what can be done, where one should start, and how to proceed. That's the first step you naturally have to take. Otherwise, thank you, Nico. I always find it cool to follow your podcast and see what topics you bring up. Therefore, I'm curious about what other topics will come up in the future, and of course, wish all listeners a lot of fun with the upcoming episodes as well.